Always impressed me when the Zoom sorts out the difference between the green screen and my green shirt.
Yeah. Let's see.
Hey guys, this is
Hey.
starting to look like familiar faces.
Yeah. We'll give it another couple minutes and then maybe call it.
Yeah.
I heard at least Brad said that he was going to be 15 minutes late, so I'm guessing they have something going on that side.
Yeah. Give me just a second here. All right. I mean, it does look like we have a bit of a quorum, so we can get started here. As a reminder, this meeting is being recorded. It'll be uploaded to YouTube shortly after. And your attendance in the meeting is an agreement to abide by the OpenSSF Code of Conduct. And for folks who are joining, feel free to go in there and put in your put your attendance in the meeting list. All right, so we don't really have a lot on the agenda other than just kind of going through that document again. And let me actually pull that up myself here. And we can, because we do want to kind of, see if we can throw this out there, see if there are folks who are interested in certain element of Fresca, and if so, if we can kind of get some folks to contribute. Just as a reminder, I've been getting a lot of folks externally who seem interested in learning more about Fresca, joining Fresca, and I'm sure everybody's busy, so they've been unable to attend this meeting or look at the GitHub issues. So I'm trying to figure out if there's anything we can do on that front. But personally, I'm very much being sort of deprioritized, and if folks are not super interested in some of the features or whatever here, I'm going to need to pull back a little bit more from this. But anyway, we can kind of get into it, unless if folks have other things that they wanted to bring up before we get into that document. All right. Okay, so I rewrote the document. It's now about 2 pages long. More or less, the intro 2 paragraphs here are just an introduction to the why we built Fresca. So a lot of it comes down to, there was a lot of stuff coming out about supply chain, software supply chain security, about 2 years ago. Things were, we had the SolarWinds Sunburst attack that was still kind of, that had blown up. We were having stuff like various other attacks throughout this time were blowing up. And a lot of folks were like, hey, the build seems to be very important and nobody seems to be doing a lot around securing the build. A lot of talk about how a lot of folks' CI/CD systems were more or less just open and developers could just run whatever. And as long as they compiled, that sort of thing would go into production. And people are saying, hey, that's probably not a great idea, especially given that a lot of these systems, it was very easy to reveal the secret keys that were used for signing and all that good stuff. And then the second paragraph just sort of says, hey, so that's why we built Fresca. There were a lot of tools, or there are a lot of tools, I should say, and things within that space that were emerging, like Spire and Tecton and all these other things that could make a secure build. And there were like a lot of demos around it, but nothing that really sort of tied all those pieces together. And so Fresca sort of emerged out of that, of, hey, why don't we actually start to tie all those pieces together into one more like cohesive system, so that, for example, right, we use Tecton with SPIFFE Spire in order to we use Tecton with SPIFFE Spire in order to apply SPIFFE workload identities to what's actually the builds that are actually happening within Tecton, which means that if an administrator of the the Kubernetes cluster that Tecton's running in messes with some of the jobs, or if something else messes with some of the jobs that are running, the SPIFFE identities would no longer be valid. Folks like B. Mitch and Parth know a lot more about like the details, exactly how that works, but generally, those workload identities, we get protection against stuff like jobs trying to mess with other jobs because of permissions or whatever, or administrators of the cluster, or admins of like Fresca itself from being able to mess with jobs that are running within Fresca. The goal of Fresca, the high level goal was, we want to help secure the build process, right? That's really what the purpose was, right? We were looking at stuff like, what was happening in SolarWinds, and like, okay, what can we do to help secure the build process, not just from specifically the SolarWinds attack, but from all sorts of classes of attack. And in the architectural documents, we get a little bit more into that, but basically the 3 high level things are: we want to protect, we want to make sure that only jobs that are running secure tasks, right, or secure sets of tasks are allowed to run, right? So if you were required to generate an SBOM, you don't get to deploy a pipeline that does not generate an SBOM, that kind of thing. And if you are required to run certain security scans, you are required to run certain security scans. Protect against administrators or operators within the build itself, so within the within Fresca or the the build system. And then finally, have the ability to generate the ability to monitor and protect against like threats inside the build itself. So stuff like the build's trying to reach out to malware.com, that kind of thing. And so that's kind of like the high level there for Fresca so we are following sort of existing, sort of framework architecture standards and best practices. Framework. We want to, leverage existing tools and components, and then we want to have securities enforced by design as opposed to sort of opt-in, which is the way that it works with a lot of the existing systems. It was very much an opt-in, like you turn on this security scan, you turn on this security feature, as opposed to the goal. One of the ideas behind Fresca was that it's there it's there by default, right? And so it does this by being primarily two things, right? A suite of build, pipeline, yada, yada, like a bunch of different tools that are configured to operate securely. And then actually probably add in there, operate securely and run builds securely, right? And then it's a set of build pipeline abstractions and definitions with security guardrails, ensuring all builds follow supply chain security best practices, right? So the abstraction here is, hey, I have a Go build, great, you have a Go build, but that Go build itself consists of this, a Go security linting step, a Go generate SBOM step, and so on, right? What is Fresca today? So Fresca is a bunch of different components, right? Like it's Tecton Chain, Spire, Kyverno, Sigstore, Vault, and Cert Manager, as well as some Q code that helps wrap the pieces together. This allows it to be compliant with, SALSA and the CNCF Secure Software Factory Reference Architecture. And then tomorrow, what could, Fresca be, right? Well, Fresca, could have an easier deployment. Fresca could have better pipeline abstractions. Fresca could have a Fresca CLI tool that makes a lot of this sort of stuff easier to do. And so then, the rest is just kind of like a call to action, just sort of saying, hey, who do we need? Well, we mostly need two sets of folks. Like one is hands-on keyboard engineers who can help contribute to the features and functionality of Fresca. And then the other one is end users for their use cases, which that I think is probably maybe the more important one to sort of talk through here. But the basic idea, right, is we kind of have a bit of a scenario where, when talking to some end users, they have found value in Fresca as an example, just sort of saying, hey, I looked at what you were doing with Spiffy Spire and blah, 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 and that gave me an idea for my own internal implementation, which, hey, that's great. But if it comes down to, do folks want to see Fresca actually as a tool that they can deploy or like a system that they can deploy? That seems a little less likely at this point. And so the idea is like, we need to just kind of get more use cases from folks to understand like, hey, what are the concerns that they have with their build, or do they not have concerns with their build? And they're comfortable sort of running, Jenkins. Because I know one of the things in some of the conversations I've had is largely, even though folks do think that build security is important, they don't believe build security to be important enough to really make the changes that would be required to have secure builds. Right, and this includes, this is also some of the feedback folks have given on Fresca is just, hey, it's great that we want to build more securely. I don't have the budget to do so. So anyway, I think that's kind of that's really about it there. Just wanted to kind of go over it one last time.
Awesome. I love the updates. I love the structure and the flow of it now. It got me thinking about a couple of things that I don't know that they're necessarily it's always hard with things like this, right? It's like you start pulling on the string, and it's like a tangled mess of spaghetti, of like there's so much more we could do, and like there's so and that's kind of where we started. I don't want to push back towards the direction of like longer or more content, but let me just say what I'm trying to say. The community aspect of this is one that I hadn't thought about as much before, and the idea of like what Fresca is trying to achieve, or I think was it like when we start talking about like helping people understand supply chain security and learning and having an example and practice, like there's a lot more we could do in that space without changing anything about Fresca today. Like just using Fresca, just building out more examples. And I think that is like a really big opportunity. And it's a slightly different type of opportunity. Like we can solicit different people to come and contribute to that. Like I look at, just as an example, Chain Guard Academy, right? Like they have a huge library of things for people to help like learn about supply chain security. And I think that when I look at OpenSSF, and this is kind of like a supply chain integrity positioning thought process I'm having right now, which is the like, there's so many deep in the weeds working groups and parts of this, of like, you want to know every little detail of salsa. You want to help design and build the next version of the spec. That's awesome. You should absolutely join the salsa spec meeting, or the S2C2F. Like you're really interested in how to secure the consume open source. But then there's still like a lot of people with like, how do I secure software supply chain? They don't even know. Or to Michael, like I use my little sob emoji of like, we think it's too expensive to implement a secure software supply chain. Like that just makes me cry. Like it makes me so sad that people like put that second. So like, can we, or is there interest in building a community around secure software supply chain practices and principles and things like that? And is Fresca, like there's the project, but is there a broader thing for the community there? And is there a place for that? Just a thought and an idea. Curious for other folks' feedback. And it's perfectly okay for this to be in the bucket of things, which is the like, this is a great idea, but nobody has any time for it. Just
Well, I will say, oh, go ahead, Arna.
No, I have a separate comment, so go ahead if you want to answer this.
So that was kind of one of the reasons for, Fresca, that was one of the reasons why there was interest in Fresca when we had originally contributed it, right? When City had contributed it to OpenSSF, was OpenSSF had a lot of stuff like Salsa and some of these other like things around, security, supply chain compromise and best practices and those sorts of things. And so the idea was Fresca could be an implementation of these various practices. And to be clear, I think this is still an indicator of other concerns that we have as well, which is, and I don't want to be all doom and gloom by any means. I just think that as a community, we just need to do a better job. Is a lot of folks are like, hey, yeah, there's a lot of best practices. There's a lot of things I should be doing. You still haven't done enough to convince me that I should be doing those things. Which seems to be like outside of like if you talk about, and I don't want to go down that rabbit hole, but if you talk about stuff like hey, I'm building a cybersecurity product. Absolutely. Yeah, this is what I should be doing. I must be doing all these different things. But if you talk about, to the average person and you say, hey, I'm already thinking about SQL injections, I'm already thinking about all these different things, and now you're saying I need to think about the secure build, that's not going to happen. So that's kind of, I think, the thing that's sort of coming out of a lot of it, which is just, it's less about the best practices, and it's more about how do you make those best practices just something that the other person doesn't have to think about. Right, the idea right behind something like a Fresca is just, you just say, hey, I'm a go build, and we just build it securely. We get you your SBOM, we get you everything, right? That's kind of like the goal there. I think the problem is when you tell people, yeah, you need to install all these things, like you need to install in Toto and Tecton Chain, Spiffy Spire, Kyverno, etc. They go and say, yeah, not going to happen. Sorry, Arno.
And also, I had a different comment, which is, I think the paper looks good. I mean, overall, I think it covers what you want, and so I think that's pretty good. The comment I have is, I think you need to add a few more links. It's pretty basic, but you can't expect people to know necessarily what S2C, 2F, or even Salsa is. And I think when you talk about the build part, which is what Fresca is focusing on, it would be useful to refer to maybe what's in Salsa, the threat model with the pipeline, so that people can see what piece you're talking about in the supply chain. Again, if we are talking about people like John was referring to, where, they're not necessarily completely embedded into this as we are, and they've heard about supply chain security, and they're like, okay, where do I start? And they may not understand exactly what we refer to when we say, oh, we refer to the build part. It's like, okay, if you can provide a bit more context, like there, you say in the build piece of the software supply chain. It's like, I know what that what you mean. I don't know that a casual reader would necessarily know. So I think adding a bit more background info on those things. It doesn't have to be in the document. I think you can get away with having, well-chosen links.
Yeah, that helps. Yeah, I think. But yeah, I mean, I think since this is sort of more or less with a few extra sort of links and maybe a clarification. Let me just put as a comment here. Right. And some of the links I've been leaving out because I feel like if whatever this ends up being, if it ends up being something like that's in Markdown or something, then it that doesn't copy in.
No, I understand that.
Yeah. So, but hold on here. We just. And then all right. So yeah, that makes sense. And then I think that still kind of ties into the next piece, which is just okay. So like, let's say that we throw this out there. The thing that just to be clear, like that I'm still trying to kind of figure out is how do we begin to get folks in, right, contributing, and that sort of thing, because I've had a lot of folks from across the gamut, right, multiple folks, not just yourself, John, from VMware, a few other folks from a bunch of different companies, like even MITRE and some other places. But when it's come to sort of say, okay, great, let's sit down and start contributing, there seems to be a lack of actual folks who, let's say, know a lot of the Kubernetes stuff or whatever. So yeah, I mean, if there's suggestions on how we might be able to do that and so on.
Unfortunately, that's a common problem that you find in across, a lot of open source projects that are looking for more help. There is no magic bullet. I think, generally speaking, is making sure people know about it and that you're looking for help. And I think as you get more users, there's at least a portion of those, of the users that will have some desires that are not met, and maybe they'll be able to, they'll want to roll up their sleeves and start working on it. That's typically the recipe for open source.
Well, yeah, I mean, I think that still ties back into the like, hey, what do we see Fresca being? Right. And this is, stuff that like I agree with what Jonathan's comments that he made was it yesterday at Salsa meeting, but one of the meetings, the Salsa positioning meeting, I believe, which is just, I know there's some disagreement. I know that there's some folks, right, like there's the thing I noticed about Fresca is Fresca seems to be popular as a learning tool among large enterprises, because a lot of large enterprises say, hey, like I'm on Jenkins, but I know I need to move off of it because of this, that, or the other thing. Or I'm already have a Tecton, but I have no idea how I'm supposed to secure it. Oh, cool, I can look at some of this stuff and hey, you're using Kyverno, but I could probably have my folks, look at OPA instead, right? Or you're looking at Spiffy Spire, I can't get that installed, but maybe I can do this, this, and this as mitigating controls against that sort of process. And that has proven to be valuable for some folks. But kind of moving forward, like, hey, is there, what can, what do, I think the thing that I'm still trying to kind of go through is, before we even kind of get contributions, like, hey, who's using Fresca, or what do folks actually want to see out of Fresca? And I think anything's on the table, right? Up to and including, hey, maybe the existing Fresca is just this thing, we leave it out there and then we focus more on a different piece, right? I know one of the things that other folks like Jonathan and even Brendan Mitchell and then a few other folks had brought up is like that idea of, the actual thing that does the build seems to be the thing that folks want secured. And stuff like, as an example there, right, is, hey, Fresca is great if you have, let's say, 1 million different steps you also want to secure and yada, yada. But like for a lot of folks, they're just like, I just want to be able to know that I ran a build in a secure way. Like my build container didn't contain, vulnerabilities that I ran my build, like I want to run hermetic builds, but I don't want to have to, do a ton of work and effort to make that hermetic. And I want to do this, that, and the other thing to secure those things. And like, you don't necessarily need Tecton for that, right? You just need to have, do a whole bunch of magic with stuff like, I mean, I remember back in the day, right, using BSD jails and those sorts of things of why you would, do some of that stuff. But, some folks have talked about that. Some folks have said, hey, no, we'd love to see Fresca extend into other parts and just be a representative example. But once again, I think I would love to hear from actual potential end users of Fresca or what they would love to see from Fresca.
I think I heard one of the other groups is building an explicit course, a training course. I don't know if it's a S2 C2F of like to help folks understand better the framework and things like that. I'm wondering if there would be utility in like trying to have a formalized course with Fresca, and if we could, we're kind of like the timing is slightly off with like conference, but like it would be great to, and maybe the next target would be like KubeCon, which gives us some time, like KubeCon in the US, so like Chicago, to have an actual labs, like a lab or whatever, what do they call it normally? Like a workshop type event where we could try and physically bring people together. And we can try and do an ad hoc version of this at the Security Village in KubeCon EU. But we've got like 2 weeks to prepare for it. But if nothing else, we could sit down and try and like interview people, or like just try and like bring it up with everybody and be those. I don't feel bad about doing it for an open source project. I'd feel really obnoxious if I was like pitching my proprietary vendor product to everybody, but like taking Fresca and basically just pitching it to the like, because I definitely hear your point, Michael, of like really hearing from end users, and I can talk for all of the time that we have about like what I think they want, but that's very different than like actually hearing from them. And so it would be really interesting to have a way, and I'm saying all of this, I'm also willing to do some of the work on that. So I know you had also said like I have personally, I will admit I have not opened any issues or submitted any code to Fresca. I've run some of the samples and demos and things like that, but I think that's the direction I'm interested in. Separate from that, there is, I've been spending, and some groups internally have been spending some time thinking about some of these other problems, which is the like abstracting some of the supply chain concerns from the build mechanism or the pipeline mechanism itself, of like, how do we, like the most obvious example, and there's some open source stuff around Cartographer is the name of the open source project, of like, how do you wrap something like Tecton, or wrap something like Jenkins, or wrap something, any CI/CD pipeline. And so I would love for that group to eventually try and contribute at least the ideas back here. But I think that having that run in the background while also getting more end users would be helpful. So sign me up. And also the other thing, Michael, I'm curious for your perspective of like, and I know you have a lot of other stuff going on, like if you need help facilitating this meeting or anything else, like I can help with that as well too, of like just trying to help keep beating the drum until we can try and like drive hopefully some organic adoption of these things.
Yeah, I think that could definitely help there, and I think would appreciate it.
I mean, typically, right, contributions come from users or vendors, the companies that have an offering based on the piece of software you're developing. This is where, contributions will come if they do. And so anything you do to kind of foster adoption will eventually lead to that.
Oh yeah, yeah.
That was one other area I was thinking of from the, like, I had a question in here about kind of the, like, if Fresca weren't built today, how would we build it again? Would we build it differently? Would we tell people to just go buy some vendor solution? And that triggered the thought in my head of like, could Fresca in some ways like help be a buyer's guide for people? Like Gartner has a whole new category they're building out for the cloud native security platforms or something like that. I forget exactly what it was called, but they're cloud native application protection platforms, like to be a buyer's guide for like, how do you talk to your vendors and not let them bamboozle you with here's all these like convolute. And I've started to see some pushback as well from people writing articles and things like that about like even the idea of secure builds, of like people aren't really going to try and attack your CI/CD systems, or like it's too expensive compared to all the other like low-hanging fruit. And it's hard to disagree with those, and like, and it's the same sort of pushback, but at the same time, it's like, it would be great to offer people the support they need to like have better conversations around that. So
Yeah, I think that's useful, and I see actually Rahul has some pretty good feedback in the chat as well around sort of saying, you know, I think that's a thing that, you know, so there's two separate problems. I think maybe the audience within here has been very focused on sort of thinking about it as developers, and I think a lot of it is because OpenSSF, and I think John, you had mentioned, you know, we should probably talk at like a DevOps day or something like that, because there's going to be a set of folks who they are responsible for an enterprise's CI/CD, right? You know, you usually don't see development teams spinning up their own Jenkins. They're required to write a Jenkins file or something like that, but they're not spinning up their own Jenkins. They might need to write like their own GitHub action or whatever, but they're not like deploying out the GitHub themselves and so on. And I think that sort of thing, you know, finding that audience as well is going to be useful, because for a lot of those folks, I know, like, you know, and a lot of this is coming from my biases, having lived in mostly the DevOps workspace most of my career, is, you know, most of my time was spent with stuff like, you know, Puppet and Chef and Ansible and Terraform and those sorts of things, and like trying to make sure that I could deploy out, you know, tools that developers would then use to run CI/CD. So, you know, stuff like Jenkins and things like that, and then also configuring Jenkins to be secure and doing all that work. And I know, like, if I had something like Fresca back in the day, oh, my life would be so much easier because I wouldn't have to, like, I could give folks like, hey, here's a suite of tools, just go use it. I don't need to think about how you're going to abuse the system as much because there's enough controls in place where I feel a bit more confident. You know, I've worked at places that have had to, you know, they manually audit all the images used in their builds like every, you know, month to say, hey, you got to update that, right? Whereas the idea behind Fresca, right, is, oh, okay, cool. You just sort of add some of that into policy and it goes away, right? Like, you add some of that into policy and it goes, oh yeah, you can't run this build anymore, you know, because you're using an older version of this build tool. And the idea would be Fresca could automatically update it. Or, you know, in cases where it can't, you know, it would just tell you, hey, this needs to be updated or this needs to be fixed to something else. And so the idea was to try and make it super simple for you know, developers and to use, as well as make it easier for DevOps to sort of build and operate or implement and operate. And then to the other thing you had mentioned, yeah, I think it still would be useful to just really kind of dive in and figure out, you know, like if we were to rebuild this again, I would probably have taken a bit of a different direction, to kind of echo a little bit of, like, I think Fresca itself is still important. I just think that one of the things is perhaps Fresca is a solution for people. It's a solution that's like the one person who had spoken to us about this had described it as Fresca is the concept car, right? You know, there's a ton of features on it that eventually will end up in other systems further down the line, but you don't have many people buying the concept car, right? You know, a couple of the things might end up in something like a supercar or whatever, and you're gonna have a handful of folks who want that, but the majority of folks are just like, oh, great, yeah, I'd love to have this, but I want to have it on a normal car, right? I want to have this in, you know, I want to have this in my, you know, my existing workflow, or I want it to be straightforward and simple enough that I'm not reinventing my entire world to adopt this random thing. Whereas, and so if I were to redo it again, my 2 cents is I would focus purely on the build piece for a bit, right? And say, hey, look, there's a lot of steps you can do. Those steps are going to be potentially insecure, but you might not necessarily care, right? You might say, hey, the thing that generates the SBOM, if that happens in a slightly less secure thing than the build, maybe that's okay. But the build itself, the compilation step, the step that takes a bunch of code and transforms it into a binary package, that I want to make sure is super secure. And maybe focus more on something that could integrate with Jenkins and all these other tools would be where you would want to do that. And so like I can say like literally what I had done at a previous job was I built a build system that could only run 3 things, right? Oh, so it only ran a build. It could only run the build. And that build was 3 steps. And it was all hermetic and all that sort of stuff, where it spun up a container that only had access to download source and dependencies to a shared drive. You had a build container that could only build against that shared drive, right? And output to a separate shared drive. It could only read from one and output to the other. And then finally, you had one that could only, and it had no access to the internet, and it literally only had like the build tool. That is literally it. And then the third one, which is essentially the same as the first, it just had a publishing. It had the ability to publish to the package repository, and the various we had various IAM permissions. Those are the only 3 things it could do. And because of that, we felt a lot more comfortable that the build itself wasn't compromised, right? Or if the build was compromised, that it was an upstream dependency or malicious source or something like that, as opposed to the build system itself, because the build was happening within a hermetic sort of environment. Everything was super isolated. We had tons of network controls, yada, yada. And so if you could, I think from what people have said is if you could package that up and just sort of say, I give you Go code and the output is secure Go code, is a secure Go binary, that would be great. That seems to be the thing that folks say. And then they say, like, I would love to be able to do that in my existing CI system. I want to have Jenkins call, like, I want to say, hey, Jenkins, I want to have a step that calls the secure builder. Or as Raul said, like, hey, I want to have the ability to say, Azure DevOps, here's my code, run it securely, right? And that's it. And take out the rest of it, from the developer who doesn't have to think about it, or even the DevOps person now doesn't have to deploy a whole new CI system, especially if you have legacy systems with thousands. I've worked at places that had tens of thousands of Jenkins builds. Now as opposed to saying, hey, we need to migrate those tens of thousands of Jenkins build to a new system, even if it is a relatively straightforward process that could be mostly automated, dealing with the knock-on effects of moving that all over is always a bit of a mess. So if I were to redo it again, that's, I think, how I would probably redo it, but that's just my 2 cents. I would love to hear other folks' feedback. And I think Brendan Mitchell also has similar thoughts around there with stuff like build kit and so on.
Sorry, you saved my name to the very end there, and I was paying attention to a PR that I was working on.
Oh, yeah, no problem. No, I was just saying, I was just saying how if I were to redo this again, I would focus more just purely on the secure build element and make that more integrated with whatever somebody's CI system is. I think the idea here is still like, right, Fresca could quite easily be something that somebody just sort of calls, right? Like, hey, my GitHub action calls into into a Fresca, and it runs the secure builds pieces. The other stuff like my QA and everything else that is hooked in through my Jenkins pipelines, that still runs through Jenkins, but the actual sort of secure elements happen within a Fresca. I think is still potentially, there's still some value there, but I think the thing that the core piece of it is just people want to be able to say, hey, I just ran this step and it ran it securely. I did not have to think about how to run it securely. I just, and it plugged into my existing CI system, right? I was able to just sort of say, as opposed to saying, hey, Tecton, run this build image and this build command, right? And thinking that like, oh, actually, I need to go and do this to secure it, and I need to run this, this, and this. I need to run Spire, blah, blah, blah. I want to be able to just say, hey, Tecton, can you call to the secure build piece?
Yeah. And it gets back to, I think, the biggest problem that Fresca and everybody else has when they're trying to solve this, that you've always got the lower turtle. There's always
Oh,
the challenge of you build your secure builder, but that's sitting on top of a Kubernetes infrastructure, sitting on top of Tecton, everything else running in some VM in a cloud. And how do you protect when you don't control those lower levels below you? And so part of that for me is looking more toward the reproducible builds and how that can help mitigate some of those issues, where instead of having one secure infrastructure where you're worried about the lower turtles, you have multiple and different security zones. And that way you delegate that problem out to saying, hey, an attacker would have to hit multiple simultaneously. But that's probably getting beyond the scope of what we've been trying to do with Fresca.
yeah, and I think there's some interesting folks doing some work on that now. Like, for example, for the Nix and NixOS stuff, there's Trustix, where they run the same Nix. They run various Nix builds across multiple implementation, well, not implementations, and that of course also leads to other things of like, because it's not just about separate trust domains, it's also about like, you probably want to say, hey, I ran this one on Debian, but I ran this one on like Red Hat or Arch or whatever, right? Like, you want to have it running on multiple different distributions and multiple different things, because you want to say like, hey, great, like, yeah, I'm running different versions of those things, because they're going to come in and if it turns out Debian version blah is compromised, then you've just reproducibly compromised your stuff. But yeah, I think that sort of stuff that sort of stuff I think is really interesting. And I know, like, this is something that I've been poking around with in my off hours, is just the rebuilding sort of what I had built at another place using like Rust, and just sort of saying, hey, let me create something that uses namespaces, isolates everything, right? Like, has a builder that, like, not just it wouldn't run in Kubernetes. The idea would be, would just run on a VM, and the security elements there are still you would have to think through you would still have to think through stuff like how do you secure the VM, but the basic idea, right, would be, hey, I deploy out this super simple build, like this super simple builder that it's a system that only builds. That's all it does. And you just sort of say, hey, great, like just to kind of go back to the thing I built previously, is that essentially it was a container orchestrator running on a very secure server, but the container orchestrator was not a generalized container orchestrator like a Kubernetes. It could only run builds. That's it. That's it. It could run those 3 steps, and if you told it to do anything else, it just broke.
Yeah. I also look toward like the projects, the Salsa GitHub generator, and how they've designed some of their work, and they've moved a lot of that effort directly into GitHub mostly, because GitHub's providing some assurances there. But by running it in their environment within VMs that are dedicated to just things that are working within their pipeline, they've got some assurances that I don't know how easy that would be to port to something that'll be self-hosted, but get some good ideas over there.
Yeah. Well, actually, that's something. Yeah. Anyway, John.
Let me tell you about this company called VMware. One of the recurring themes, and this is like, sometimes I feel too much like preaching to the choir in this group here, but like one of the recurring themes I'm seeing more and more often as concepts like attestations get broader awareness, is a lot of people are running towards some implementation of like, hey, and I mean, I can call out specific people if we want to, but I don't think I need to. Like, we can create attestations now with this build, or like we can create an SBOM, but it's like it's signed or it's not signed, or it's in a different format, or here's an entirely new framework for attestations that's different than everything else that exists. And there's like folks in the in-toto community or the tough community, like seeing a lot of these things. And we're all running really fast, which is great, but sometimes I always ask the question of like, are we running with scissors? In which case it's like maybe less great. And Fresca can be really helpful at showing the importance of the interoperability between these things, of like, we need to create these attestations in a consistent way. We need some, and it's also done a good job of picking, I think, in Toto for that model, helping to demonstrate that and the requirements of compatibility. Like if we decided we wanted to introduce a new build tool, and this is the push and the pull between the ideas of make all of the tools that people use in their CI/CD pipelines more secure. So there's a lot of tools people use in their CI/CD pipelines, or there's the how do we wrap all of this tooling in a way such that we can up level the attestations or the security in a way that offers some guarantees, but you in that case, you're always playing to the lowest common denominator. You never have the specific details. And like, and even with the salsa in the build provenance, like you have to draw the line somewhere between what you require everyone to report out versus the like, here is a schema that people can implement in the way that they choose. And there's still a downstream effect of how secure the supply chain is because of what someone decides to put there. Having Fresca as a tool to like sidestep some of that debate, but be able to demonstrate it, I think is helpful of like, hey, you, and this probably ties back into like the education piece of not all attestations are created equal. Not all SBOMs are created equal. Not all supply chains are created equal. And how do we help people understand that and make the right decisions? And then I think correspondingly, that can help push the other open source communities and vendors and things implementing solutions in this space to be more consistent, to hopefully collaborate more. Like, this is super idealistic. It's early in my day. Like, so I still believe this stuff. At the end of the day, maybe less so. Like, we can move the whole industry forward towards that. So not all verifications are created equal. I see a question mark. I don't think that they are. Depends on what you're verifying.
I was trying to add an additional item to your list. It wasn't meant to be a question. It was meant to be a, I don't know. I put lots of question marks on statements, unfortunately.
Yeah, no, that's, I completely agree. It's like, you know, even if you are trying to measure how secure your supply chain is, depending on how you measure it, you're going to get different results.
Yeah, so I think, so if I were to, you know, since we have like 7 minutes left for, since we have like 7 minutes left, if I were to take some of the takeaways from this, one was add the, you know, add the comments in here, just sort of add a couple of links, as well as just sort of maybe have like a couple of more sentences just about what the build itself is and why it's important to sort of protect. And then next steps, so it does sound like, and this is kind of, I think, one of the things that kind of came out of our, you know, when building Fresca internally, what was sort of the impetus there was we, you know, we pretty much were given wide latitude to just sort of say, look, you know, there's a lot of stuff that's going on that's a huge mess. Can you show people like what is that like North Star? What is that? What is like that shining example of what it could look like, right? You know, there's lots of different ways it could look like, but like, could you just sort of just go wild with it? So that, like, one of the reasons was to also go back, and some of this was then taken by you know, security teams to go back internally to say, hey, build team, you're not doing these things, so you're not, like, there's a lot of questions about whether or not this thing is going to be safe or secure. And so that was then used as a mechanism to then drive some of the change that was required internally, because we could go and say, you're vulnerable to, like without Spiffy Spire, right? I can go, you're an admin on that Kubernetes cluster, you can go and mess with my build. And there's very little I can see about, that would tell me that that was, whether or not that happened. Now, to be clear, that's specifically for Kubernetes-based sort of, Tecton build systems, whether it's, Tecton or Red Hat pipelines or similar. Is going to be a little bit different with some of the different build systems. That's kind of where some of that came out. And then it was the implementation of the CNCF Secure Software Factory Reference Architecture, which I helped lead up there, where, hey, like we were looking at what sorts of things would you do if you were to do this in a cloud native build capacity, right? We just want to kind of, you run a build in Kubernetes, what are the security properties you want to have there? That sort of stuff kind of came together. And so I think that's, so I guess the idea here is like, hey, does Fresca still remain, like, I think the open questions are still, does Fresca still remain as that sort of shining example, not really sort of the thing that like, we don't expect people to just sort of take it, right? Like, and just sort of consume it wholesale? Or do we want to kind of focus more on some practical elements there? And actually, one of the people I wanted to get some input from, because he, works at OpenSSF, is Jonathan. If he had thoughts on like where do you think we could get the most lift from the community and get the most feedback back from potential sort of users?
On feedback from users,
well, I guess
I mean, the best way to get feedback is, I don't know, I was working with another project, and like the best way to get feedback is to go and implement the stuff yourself and like go try to apply it to an actual project, and then you learn all the pain points. It's like you only learn about how it actually, like, rubber meets the road when you're actually driving the car. So, like being willing to, great, you can implement these things and come up with these ideas, but like if you, and you can have all this infrastructure, but like you have to actually go throw it at some projects and like realize what the pain points are, so that you can, you can say, okay, this doesn't work. Like this is not even possible to implement, stuff like that. There's some specifications that I've been working with within the OpenSSF, and I'm like, there's no like, you want this specification field to get filled out, but there's no answer to that, because like every single time that some organization, like I think one of the things that was being asked for is like, where are your SBOMs being published, right? And like, give us the URL of all your SBOMs that are being published. And I'm like, that's not a good, you can't get that answer, because if you're publishing an SBOM and you're doing it in a way that's like normally publishing a package, every single SBOM will be published at a different URL because it's versioned, right? Like, so you can't give a URL for give me where your SBOMs are, because that doesn't exist. There's no single URL for that, right? So that's my view of the OpenSSF, is like, you have these ideas, but someone has to go implement them and come back and say this doesn't work. Truly, like, does not work.
Yeah. So actually that kind of brings me to another reason why we had built Fresca the way we had, was to also sort of highlight the gaps, right? Was to say, hey, actually, there's a bunch of open questions around this thing. And in fact, we can't, do some of the things that we want to do in the space, like comply with certain, standards, best practices, until we have an answer for that thing. Because I think that's actually a really great point, right? Where we have a good SBOM distribution story for OCI, because it's just simple to keep it inside the same repo that we keep the images, and with the manifest and everything else stuff that is, has it fully been released yet, or still but anyway, I think that sort of stuff, it has been also super valuable. So anyway, I will, I know we're at time, so I will finish up this document. I'm gonna probably start poking folks within Fresca chat to see if they can maybe help out with a couple of things here and there, provide some feedback and so on.
Oh, sounds good.
Cool.
Gotta
Thanks.
go. Bye.
Thanks, Mike.
Cheers.